Chapter 1. Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. It is fascinating and at the same time rather alarming to look back along the line of the past and to note how thin was the thread which the fates spun and how easily it could have been broken. And if it had been broken, then one's life would, of course, have been quite different. How little I guessed that when a young Russian journalist on the night staff of a St. Petersburg newspaper made a journey to Moscow in the spring of 1915, he was initiating a sequence of events which was eventually to be of the utmost importance to me also. What I should have protested had a clairvoyant gypsy drawn my attention to this, what on earth have a St. Petersburg journalist's movements got to do with me, the resident surgeon to the British hospital in Buenos Aires? There seemed to be no connection at all between myself and any events occurring in Russia, and many things had to happen and many years had to flow past before the path of the stocky young Russian journalist with the cropped hair and the strong glasses crossed that of the Buenos Aires surgeon. Ouspensky tells us in his book, In Search of the Miraculous, that during this said visit of his to Moscow in the spring of 1915, two friends, a sculptor and a musician, spoke of a small group in Moscow which was engaged in certain investigations and experiments which were difficult to describe. They worked under the direction of a Caucasian Greek, and rather against his will, he agreed to be introduced to their Caucasian teacher. The meeting took place at a small cafe, and Ouspensky gives the following description of his first encounter with Gurdjieff. I saw a man of an oriental type, no longer young, with a black mustache and piercing eyes, who astonished me first of all because he seemed to be disguised and completely out of keeping with the place and its atmosphere. I was still full of impressions of the East, and this man, with the face of an Indian Raja or an Arab sheikh, seated here in this little cafe in a black overcoat and a velvet collar and a black bowler hat, produced this strange, unexpected, and almost alarming impression of a man poorly disguised, the sight of whom embarrasses you because you see he is not what he pretends to be, and yet you have to speak and behave as though you did not see it. P.D. Ouspensky, In Search of the Miraculous. They met together several times at the small cafe, and Ouspensky began to realize more and more that the man to whom he was talking here in Moscow, this man who spoke incorrect Russian with a strong Caucasian accent, was possessed of the kind of knowledge for which he, Ouspensky, had recently been seeking without success in India and Ceylon. It was the beginning of a 7 years' close association between the two men of great importance to them both. Then came the war and the revolution, which brought to an end not only the old Tsarist regime, but also all thought and culture in Russia. In 1917, Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, with several other members of Gurdjieff's group, were refugees in Constantinople, but they were as far from being any concern of the writer of this book as they had always been. Then the thin thread of events began to draw them nearer to me. There were influential people in England who had read Ouspensky's book, Tertium Organum, and who, on hearing that its author was one of the many Russian refugees stranded in Constantinople, invited him to come to London. The next significant event took place right on my doorstep at 86 Harley Street. We have been granted an interview with the Home Secretary in 20 minutes' time, and I want you to be a member of the deputation. It was my friend, Dr. Maurice Nicole, who said this, and, without giving me time to answer him, he bundled me into a waiting taxi. But what's it all about? I inquired after having been introduced to the other members of the deputation. About Gurdjieff. We have to get a permit for him to come to London. Ouspensky is already here, and we want Gurdjieff as well. You are to represent orthodox medicine and to say how important it is that Gurdjieff should be allowed to come here. Half an hour later, I found myself explaining to a board Home Secretary how essential it was to the welfare of British medicine that Gurdjieff, who was only a name to me, should be granted permission to settle in London, but the Home Office explained next day that it had already granted so many permits to White Russian officers that it was unable to issue one to Gurdjieff. So Ouspensky settled down in London and began holding meetings there, while Gurdjieff remained where he was in Paris and eventually established in a Fontainebleau chateau what had for so long been only a project in his mind, the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. Maurice Nicole was responsible for the forging of the last link in the long chain of events which had started 8 years previously with Ouspensky's fateful expedition to Moscow and his meeting with Gurdjieff. He buttonholed me one day at the corner of Weymouth Street and Harley Street and told me that Ouspensky was now holding very interesting meetings in Kensington and that he had obtained permission for me to attend. He explained that it was by private invitation only that people were allowed to come, and left me with the impression that I could consider myself very fortunate to have received an invitation. Wednesday next at 8 o'clock in Warwick Gardens, he concluded and disappeared. I have told the story of my meeting Ouspensky, of my close association with him for over 30 years, and of my subsequent encounters in Paris with that still more remarkable man, George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, in a previous book. All of these events of great concern to me and of sufficient general interest to warrant their being put on record were recounted in Venture with Ideas. But little was said in that book about the ideas taught by these two men, and it was the unique quality of their teaching even more than their characters which bound me to them for so many years. Ideas are not always passive, submissive things which we can lay aside when we have no further use for them, and this was particularly true of the ideas which I obtained either from Gurdjieff directly or else by way of Ouspensky. They were ideas heavily charged with energy, and they soon began to work in me like some powerful ferment. Attracted to them originally on the grounds that they were unlike anything that I had previously come across, they gradually took possession of me and propelled me in a direction in which at first I had no desire to go. Unlike Ouspensky, who had deliberately abandoned his work in 1914 in order to search in the East for what he called esoteric schools, I was, or believed myself to be, content with things as they were. In short, I had no need for a philosophy of life. Yet here was I, being jerked out of my usual rut of living and my customary channels of thought and feeling, not so much by the impact of two powerful men, remarkable though they both were, but by the sheer weight of their teaching. All these things are explained in Venture with Ideas. Gurdjieff was in Paris and Ouspensky in London, so it was from the latter that I learned the system of knowledge which Gurdjieff had brought back to Russia from his years of wandering in the East, and it was perhaps as well that the fates who were responsible for all that was now happening to me arranged it thus. Gurdjieff used strong medicine, and I doubt whether I should have stomached his very drastic treatment had I met him at the beginning. I owe a great deal to Ouspensky for all he did for me during those earlier years, and I am deeply grateful for him for his patient and clear-headed interpretation of Gurdjieff's teaching. He had a much better command of English than had Gurdjieff, and a methodical and tidy mind which imposed order on the latter's less systematized method of teaching. His patience was remarkable. From 1917 onwards, he sought clearer and yet clearer formulations for the ideas he had received from Gurdjieff, with the intention, possibly, for he never spoke with certainty about this, of publishing them in the form of a book after the latter's death. But he died before his teacher, and it was upon Gurdjieff that the responsibility then lay of deciding whether or not Ouspensky's much revised transcript should be sent to a publisher. Gurdjieff had a Russian rendering of it read to him, declared it to be an accurate account of his own teaching, and gave instructions that it should be published forthwith. Gurdjieff and Ouspensky are now dead, and if I am ever to put on printed record what I learnt from them, it must be now. I have hesitated for a very long time before embarking on this task, and for a great many reasons. An important one was that I was well aware of the difficulty of putting into a book a teaching so individual as that of Gurdjieff, a teaching which, to be effective, cannot be read, but must be imparted to the individuals by word of mouth. Gurdjieff believed that men and women are divisible into a comparatively small number of types, and that what is applicable to one type is not necessarily applicable to another. This being so, instruction has to be given individually, and it is obvious that this cannot be done in a book. I also foresaw the difficulty of presenting ideas, first in the raw as I received them from Ouspensky, and on then showing the gradual deepening of my understanding of them as the years passed. This slow growth of understanding could only be suggested in a book by telescoping time, and the result of this might be confusing, so that the reader would often be left in doubt whether I was describing the ideas as I had first received them from Ouspensky, or as I had understood them much later on. This method of presentation might also require that I should sometimes have to put into Ouspensky's mouth words which he had never uttered, even although they were completely in keeping with his teaching. All this made it clear to me that I should encounter many difficulties in writing about Gurdjieff's ideas. Gurdjieff once said, "I have very good leather to sell to those who want to make shoes out of it." And when these words came into my mind, they immediately gave me the right plan for the book. No better description than this could be given of Gurdjieff's role as a teacher. He was a man who had ideas of an extraordinary high quality to sell to those who required ideas of this kind. Moreover, he had used the word sell deliberately because he always maintained that men never appreciated anything which they had not paid for. The payment need not necessarily be in terms of money, but something had to have been sacrificed if the leather they had acquired was to be properly appreciated. Another important point he made in this short sentence of his was that the leather was for those who intended to put it to a practical use, and not for dilettantes or exhibitionists who required it merely for display. The buyer would have to make something out of the leather he had bought, and nothing could be more serviceable than a strong pair of shoes for life's difficult journey. I saw that the aim I should have to keep in view whilst writing the projected book was that of showing the reader the excellence of Gurdjieff's leather, and of often displaying the shoes I had made out of it. The workmanship and design of my new shoes could, of course, have been much better, but they have this at any rate to be said in their favor, and they are handmade in my own work. As will later be seen, having given an account of Gurdjieff's ideas, I often compare them with kindred ideas obtained from scientific, philosophical, and religious sources. These comparisons have been made because it has long been of great interest to me personally to compare and to contrast Gurdjieff's ideas with those I have come across in a somewhat varied reading during the course of the past 30 years. Many striking similarities have been discovered in this way, but what I want to emphasize here is that nowhere else can so many ideas of this nature be found welded together into such a self-consistent and coherent whole. Or it would perhaps be better to use an entirely different simile and to liken Gurdjieff's system of knowledge to a living organism, in which every part is related to and dependent on everything else. It is because Gurdjieff's teaching possesses the qualities of coherence, integration, and growth, characteristic of life, that I am attempting to bring it to the notice of other people, so far as it is possible to do this in a book. This last conditional clause is necessary, for formulation and printing squeeze out of the spoken word almost all of its vitality, as pressing deprives a flower of nearly all its beauty. The great religions have all been subjected to this devitalizing process. As taught by their great founders, they were beautiful, living things, but as later set down in books and scrolls by the scribes, the Pharisees, and lawyers, they become as forlorn and as desiccated as are the 39 articles of the Anglican Church. Unfortunately, there is no way of avoiding the devitalizing effects of books on oral teaching, and all that can be done in the present instance is to warn the reader that it is bound to happen. He must be put on his guard on another score also, to wit, on the use of the word system in connection with Gurdjieff's teaching. It is a term which should have been avoided had it not been sanctioned by long use. The reason for its being objectionable is that the term system is closely linked in our minds with such qualifying adjectives as correct and incorrect, orthodox and heterodox, and these are words to which Gurdjieff would have taken strong exception. They are words to which another modern teacher of spiritual truths also takes exception. Krishnamurti deplores our tendency to organize and systematize wisdom and illustrates this with a parable. He recounts how one day the devil and a friend of his were out for a walk on the earth when they noticed a man suddenly bend down and pick up something from the ground. The devil's friend said, "You had better be on your guard, for that man over there has picked up a particle of truth." The devil smiled and was not in the least disturbed. "It will make no difference," he replied. "They will organize and systematize it. There is no cause for worry." The Zen Buddhist master likens all teaching to the pointing of a finger at the moon, and his disciple is very severely reprimanded if he places emphasis on the finger instead of the object at which the finger is pointing. So also must Gurdjieff's teaching be looked upon as a finger which directs attention to certain principles and methods which, properly used, lead to certain results. All that this book can do is to give the reader a notion of some of the methods and principles Gurdjieff used. To imagine that any book could achieve more than this would obviously be absurd. Gurdjieff did not draw diagrams on a board and teach from these. His method of instruction was far less comfortable to his class than this. He carved out from us living chunks of experience and taught from these. One found one's own petty vanities and follies being used as the specimens on which Gurdjieff was able to demonstrate to his class the mechanical nature of human life. A book is but a poor substitute for such vital and direct teaching as this.